I may have said something in the end of the previous shir that we're up to the top of Daf Lamed Amud Aleph. If I said that, I stand corrected. We're up to the top of Daf Lamed Amud Beis, and we're up to Ula Rav Nachman on the top of Lamed Amud Beis. So again, just to reemphasize, we've explained Rav Ashi's opinion, and now the Gemara is going to focus on Rav Nachman, because Rav Nachman made a diuk in the first Mishnah on Daf Lamed Amud Aleph, and he concluded and proved, according to his Shita, that the first Mishnah is maintaining Ein Zika. So Rav Nachman, Kasha de Rav Ashi. After all, Rav Ashi was medayik from our Mishnah on the bottom of Lamed Amud Aleph that Yesh Zika. And that's why the Tana didn't mention that B'tchila Levi died, and then afterwards Reuven was megarish his wife Rachel, because in that case, says Rav Ashi, if Levi died first, then at that moment in time, Sarah and Rachel were both married to Reuven, because it was only after the death of Levi that Reuven divorced his wife Rachel. Let's just go over that one more time, just to make sure we got the facts straight. Taima, says Rav Ashi, the Geresh, the Achakach Mes. Avol Mes, the Achakach Geresh. If at the time that Levi died and Sarah fell for Yevamot to both Reuven and Shimon, Reuven at that moment was still married to Rachel, and only subsequently did he divorce Rachel. Therefore, at one moment in time, Levi's wife Sarah is a Sarah to Rachel. And the reason for that is because since Reuben hasn't yet divorced his wife Rachel, and now we hold Yesh Zika, and Levi's wife Sarah falls for Yevamot to Reuven, and a moment in which Reuven is married to Rachel, Rachel is an erva as far as Shimon is concerned. Therefore, when Reuven dies, even though Reuven had already divorced his wife Rachel, Shimon cannot be miyabim Sarah. So we see clearly that Yesh Zika. The Chi Tema, now the Gemara presents a possibility that the Mishnah's scenario is not Dafka, V'hu adin afilu mes, even if Levi, Sarah's husband, died first, and therefore Sarah fell for Yevamot to Reuven and Shimon. Reuven is married to Rachel, and only Acharkach Geresh Reuven. Later, after the death of Levi, when Sarah had already fallen for Yevamot for Reuven, and Reuven is now still married to Leah, only to Rachel, only subsequently he divorces Rachel, is Sarasa, meaning Sarah Muteres. She does fall for Yevamot, but now Rav Nachman is going to have to answer the question. So why did the Mishnah make a big deal about the fact that that Levi died after the Gerushin. Correct? Right, the Gerish Yachkach Meis. Even according to Rav Nachman, even in the case of Mes, where Sarah, Levi's wife, fell for Yibum to Reuven and Shimon, and Reuven is married to Rachel, if we're holding a Zika, then since Shimon was never miyabim Rachel and Levi was never miyabim Rachel, so why is Sarah Ashes Levi considered Sarah's erva? So who adin dafilu mes v'achak geresh Sarasa muteres, because ain't Zika. We're holding now like Rav Nachman ain't Zika. So that even if Sarah fell for Yibum while the marriage between Rachel and Reuven was still very much active and alive and well, Sarah is not an H and not a Sarah's erva, because Levi was not miyabim Rachel, although Rachel fell for Yibum to Levi, but he wasn't miyabim her. So now we have a real problem, because the Mishnah went out of its way to add the word zuhi, implying an exclusion if you change the sequence of events. Meaning that if Levi died first and Sarah fell for Yibum to Reuven, who's still right now at this point of marriage married to Rachel, then in that case, there would be no Yibum, because Sarah would have the status of a Tzaras Erva. Just 1 second. Correct, that's the Lamute Mai. If you have Zohi, it's Lamute in that case, where there would be no possibility of Yibum, whereas according to Rav Nachman, who holds Ein Zika, there should be a possibility of Yibum. So the Gemara is going to say now that according to Rav Nachman, it's Lav Dafka, and Sarah falls for Yibum, and she's Muteris Yibum, even if Levi died and Sarah fell for Yibum to Reuven before the get of Rachel. But the Zu-Hi is coming for a mute for something else. Lima'ute Kanas v'achakak Girish. In other words, what's Kanas? Levi, when he dies, and his wife Sarah falls for Yibum in front of Reuven and Shimon, Reuven actually went ahead and he was miyabim Sarah. At the moment that he was miyabim Sarah, and he's also married at the same time to Rachel, who's an erva to Shimon, even though subsequently Reuven delivers a get to Rachel, and then he dies, and now Sarah, who is his full-fledged wife, because Reuven was miyabim Sarah, is then, in that case, there's no possibility of Yibum to Sarah, because clearly Sarah and Rachel at Sarah Zuluzu. They were both fully married to Reuven at the same time. So Rachel, who's the Achos Leah, and is an erva to Shimon, now patters up Sarah Hatzara Milis Yamin. Even though, again, by the time Reuven died, he was no longer married to Rachel. But in this case, even Rav Nachman, who holds Ein Zika, would say that Sarah has the status of Itzaras ever by virtue of Rachel, because she, Sarah, and Rachel were both married, and I emphasize the word married because we're not talking about Zika's Yibum, Ein Zika, to Ruvain simultaneous. Okay, we'll take a 2-minute break. Now, as we move on here on Daf Lamed Amid Beis, let us give a little introduction. In the Mishnah back on Daf Beis Amid Beis, which is the first Mishnah in the Masechta, with regard to Arayos and the P'tur of Tzaras Erva, the Mishnah says that if there was a gerushin on the part of the Baal HaErva, so to speak, then his other wife will fall for Yibum, because once he divorces during his lifetime, the Erva, the Tzara, is no longer Tzaras Erva at the time of the Nefila. We see very clearly that according to the Mishnah, it's the moment of the Misa that determines whether or not there'll be a Chiyuv Yibum to his wives. And if at the moment of his death he's no longer married to the Erva, then the Tzara is not a Tzaras Erva. Now, the Gemara on Daf Yud Gimel raised the question, a stira to the Mishnah at the beginning of the Masechta from our Mishnah here on Daf Lamed Amid Aleph on the previous Amud, because we could be medayek from our Mishnah on Daf Lamed that Sarah falls for Yibum to Shimon, and Shimon could be miyabim her, but that's contingent on the fact that Ruvain delivered a get to his wife Rachel before the Yibum of Sarah. So that Sarah and Rachel were never Tzaros. But the implication was that if there would be a Yibum to Sarah, and then Ruvain would divorce his wife Rachel, who is again an erva to Shimon. So since at that point in time, before the divorce was delivered to Rachel, and Ruvain had already been miyabim H's Levi after Levi's P'tira, meaning Sarah, therefore Sarah and Rachel at Sarah Zulazu, then with the death of Ruvain and Sarah falls for Yibum to Shimon, Shimon is blocked from Yibum because the status of Sarah is that of Tzaras Erva, even though at the time of Ruvain's death, Sarah was no longer a Tzaras Erva because Ruvain had already divorced his wife. But it matters not, because we look at the Shas Nesuin, and that's Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah over there on Daf, where was it? Rabbi Yirmiyah is here on Lamed or on Yud Gimel? I forget. Let's just see. So Rabbi Yirmiyah says the following, that there are two shitas amongst Tanoim that are reflected respectively in the two Mishnayos, about what exactly is the critical moment to determine the status of a Tzaras Erva and Patra from Yibum. Is it the moment of the death of the husband, or is it the moment of Nisuin? And Nisuin itself already creates B'shaita its status of a Tzaras Erva, because it's the Nisuin that ultimately causes Yibum. And therefore, the diuk that we make here in our Mishnah Daf Lamed, according to Rabbi Yirmiyah, is reflective of the shita of Nisuin, of Nesuin Mapilin. And that's Rabbi Yirmiyah on Daf Yud Gimel. Now, Rav, on the other hand, holds that it's the Shas Misa that determines the status of Itzaris Erva. And according to Rav, no one, not any Tana and any Mishnah, would question that premise. That's universally accepted. And therefore, even if Reuven was miyabem Sarah with the death of Levi before he delivered a divorce to his wife Rachel, nonetheless, Sarah would not have the status of a tzaras erva. She would fall for Yibam to Shimon, and Shimon would be miyabim if he so desires. And the reason for that is because at the Shas Misa, when Reuven actually dies, Sarah is not a tzara to Rachel because Rachel is not married to Reuven because Reuven already delivered a get. Now, according to Rav Ashi, yeah, we just presented Rabbi Yirmiyah and Rava, but according to Rav Ashi, we must assume that he is interpreting our Mishnah in light of the Shita of Shas Nesuin Kovas Din Tzaras Erva, which would mean that Rav Ashi certainly accepts the Shita of Rabbi Yirmiyah, not Rava. Because it was Rav Ashi who came up with the diuk that the Mishnah is dafka speaking about a case where the Yibum, with the death of Levi, the Yibum to Sarah took place much later on in Reuven's career because Reuven had long ago divorced his wife. But if it would have been the reverse, and there was a moment in which, let's say, after which Reuven had already been miyabim Sarah, H's Leah, and only later did he divorce his wife Rachel, but there was a moment in time when both Sarah and Rachel were married to Reuven, then Sarah's status would be that of a tzarasi erva, even though that's not true at Shas Misa, because by the time we get to Shas Misa, Reuven has already divorced his wife Rachel, but Mishas Nesuin, that's going to be Kovas, and at that point, both Rachel, the erva of Shimon, who's married to Leah's sister, and Sarah, the former wife of the late Levi, are married to Reuven. So we're sure now that Rav Ashi holds like Rav Yirmiyah, not like Rav. But now the Gemara wants to analyze Rav Nachman in this particular stira that we spoke about between the Mishnah at the beginning of the Masechta and our Mishnah here on Daf Lamed Amud Aleph. How is Rav Nachman going to reconcile that stira? Because again, according to Rav Nachman, we had this whole business about Zohi Lemute Mai Lemute Beit Shammai. But according to Rav Nachman, the Chiddush of the Mishnah is that once Reuven is miyabim Sarah, even though later on Reuven will divorce his wife Rachel, nevertheless Sarah could not fall for even to Shimon, and she has the status of a tzaras erva. I mean, that's explicitly against the first Mishnah in the Masechta that says that Giresh es bas achiv lifnei shemes is the tzara is not a tzaras erva. So again, at the time of the death of Reuven, Rachel is no longer married to Reuven. She had already received a get, and therefore she's not a tzara to Sarah, such that she would pater up Sarah from Yibum. As the Gemara says, Hanicha isavar ki Rabbi Yirmiyah. If Rav Nachman would accept Rabbi Yirmiyah's teretz to the stira by saying there is no teretz, but rather tavra, we're going to break up the continuity of these two mishnayos, Micha Shana Zu, Lo Shana Zu, Umisha, right? So we have two Tanoim and two mishnayos. The high Tana, Savar, the Tana at the beginning of the Masechet holds Misa Mapeles, the high Tana, but our Tana, the author of Amish Nesavar, Nisuin Harishonim Apilim, and therefore, as we said before, at the moment that Levi dies and Sarah falls for Yibum to Reuven, and at that moment Reuven has not yet divorced his wife, then even though he subsequently divorced his wife before his own death, obviously, then there's no Yibum from Sarah to Shimon because she's already a Taurus Erva. Is Zoe Lemute Kanas Ulubasov Geresh. Which means that the Zoe should be taken the way we originally understood it, literally and simply, that if there was a Yibum between Reuven and Sarah before the Gerish and El Basof Geresh, then in such a case, when Reuven dies, Shimon is blocked from being Miyamim Sarah because Sarah is a Tzaras Erva. And that's all based on Shas Nesuin. And that's called the Nesuin Rishonim Apilim. So everything is wonderful if we make a connection here between Rav Nachman and Rabbi Yirmiyah. Ela is savrala Rava. If on the other hand Rav Nachman accepts Rava, the Amar Liolam Chad Tana, we can reconcile the two Mishnayos. We don't have to break them up and set up a machlokes. And how do we reconcile the stira between the two Mishnayos? We apply the principle of Zo, the Ein Tzarech Lomer Zo Ketani. So the Tana gives me the bigger Chiddush first in Dina Yevamot. And that's the derech of a Tana to first write the greater Chiddush and then afterwards add the lesser Chiddush. So that already from the Din Rishon, we could derive the second Din, the Din Sheni. So therefore, at the beginning of the Masechta, the Mishnah formulates the Din that if a woman was a Tzaras Erva at the time of the Suin, but the erva is completely gone by the time of the misa. For example, she got a get or she died, then the tzara is muteris l'syamin. And then in our Mishnah, the formulation is that a Yevama, who at the time of the Yibum was married l'bayla, therefore paka shem Saras Erva. And the Yevama is Muteris L'Syabim, even if, in this case, Reuven marries Sarah before he divorces his wife Rachel. And therefore, Zohi Lemute Mai is Al Karchach Ki Rabbi Yirmiyah Sphira. So we have no explanation of Zohi Lemute Mai. We have to accept the Shita of Rabbi Yirmiyah. Now the Gemara clarifies, Ula Rava, who holds that Shas Misa Kovas Tzaras Erva, according to everyone, Hanichi Savralakar of Ash, who proves from our Mishnah that Yesh Sika. So then he can interpret the Mishnah Zui Limaute Mes below Gerish. So Lamuti now, a case where Sarah would fall for Yibum. And why is that? Just 1 second. Base below Giresh. Where Sarah's status would be that of its Sarah's Erev, corrected. And there would be no Yibum. And the case would be that Levi died and his wife Sarah fell for Yibum to Reuven and Shimon. And then Reuven died. He did not take Sarah as his wife for Yibum. But now Sarah is Kuka LeReuven LeYibum, and we consider Sarah as if she was married to Reuven by virtue of Yesh Zika. And therefore, Sarah becomes a tzara of Rachel based on Zikas Yibum. So that works out, according to Rav Ashi, who holds Yesh Zika. Ella I Savralakar of Nachman. If you're going to suggest that Rava holds like Rav Nachman, who accepted the diuk from the previous Mishnah that ain't Zika, then we're not going to say that when Reuven dies and he was not miyabem Sarah, nor did he divorce his wife Rachel, that Sarah is Asura l'Shimon, because according to Rav Nachman ain't Zika, and Sarah never became a Sarah of Rachel. Because Reuven did not perform Yibum on Sarah. So now we're going to stuck with the question of Zohi Lim'ute Mai. So let's see, do we have it here? I don't have it here right now. So it says, Zui Sha'amru Kulam Shemesu and his Garshut Sarasem Utaros, which implies that there is a case where the Yavam is Asura Li, Vulamute Mai. What is this case where Sarah is Asura Li? So we're going to say it's a case where Reuven was married to Sarah and he didn't give a divorce to his wife Rachel. And then with Reuven's death, Sarah, together with Rachel, fall for Yibum. Rachel's status is that of an erva, because Shimon's married to Leah. So that Sarah's status is that of its Sarah's Achos Ishto. Is then al karcha kirav ashi sphirale. The final conclusion is that Rava has to hold like Rav Ashi, yesh zika, and therefore it's possible to say that the Mishnah is coming to exclude the case of Yevamot, who fell in front of two achim, who were married to two achios, and one of the Yevamim died, And she is Asura L'Syabim to the other brother because she's considered like an Ashes Hames through Zika. And therefore, with his death, she falls together with the Tzara, who's Asura Mishum Achos Ishto, and she patters her up from Yibum and Chalitza. And this leads us to the next Mishnah, which is here almost in the middle of Daf Lamed Amud Beis. The Kulon, all the arayas that are listed in the first Mishnah, the 15 arayas that are put from Yibum and Chalitza, they patter up that Tzara. Shahayu Bahem Safek Kedusha. We're adding the word Safek Kedusha. So there was a marriage to one of these 15 arayos, whichever one it is on the list, to one of the brothers, and in a Safek Kedusha. So we have Reuven and Shimon. Shimon marries, let's say, Sarah. And then Rivka, who's a relative of Reuven, was married to Shimon with a Safek Kedusha. The Gemara is going to explain what it means. Actually, the Mishnah is going to explain what it means by Safek Kedusha. So now it turns out that Rivka is Safek Ishto Shel Shimon. And Rivka is an erva to Reuven. Right? Rivka is one of the 15 arayos to Reuven. Shimon was Makadish Rivka with Kedusha Safek. Therefore, Reuven and Rivka have a Safek Ishto relationship. Shimon is married to Rivka. That's a Kiddushay Vadai. No, I'm sorry. Shimon is married to Sarah. And on the tzad, that the Kiddushin of Shimon to Rivka was a valid Kiddushin, since Sarah is an erva. I'm sorry, I keep getting mixed up with the names here. Since Rivka is an erva, therefore Sarah is a Safek Tzaras erva, depending upon whether or not the Kiddushin between Shimon and Rivka were valid Kiddush. Because Rivka is an erva to Reuven, and if we assume that the marriage between Shimon and Rivka was a valid marriage, then Sarah becomes a tzara of an erva because Rivka is an erva to Reuven. So when Shimon dies and Sarah falls for Yibam to Reuven, she may be maybe a Tzaras Erva. She's a Safek Tzaras Erva because Shimon was Makadesh Reuven's Erva, meaning Rivka, a Kedushay Safek. So Sarah's status when she falls for Yibam to Reuven is that of a Safek Tzaras Erva. Then the Mishnah continues and says, Gerishin B'Safek. Let's say one of these arayos received from their Baal a get that was B'Safek. The Mishnah is going to explain what's a Safek Gerishin. So let's say Shimon was Megarish Rivka with a Gerushay Safek. He has a Vadai marriage with Sarah. And now when Shimon dies, and Sarah, who's not an Erva to Reuven, falls for even to Reuven, but the question is Sarah a Tzaras Erva? Because we don't know if Shimon was still married to Rivka, he gave her a suffix get. Is harelu tzoros koltzos v'lo misyamos. I mean, we don't lose anything by requiring chalitza, and they certainly need chalitza because there's a tzad to say that the marriage was not valid or the gerushin was valid. So now the Mishnah explains: Ketzad suffix kedushin, zarek lo kedushin, suffix karav lo, zeu suffix kedushin. So again, Sarah is going to need chalitza misafek because it could be that when Shimon gave kesef kedushin to Rivka, it was karav l'Shimon, and therefore there was no chalos kedushin between Shimon and Rivka, and therefore Sarah is not at Sarah's erva. So she needs chalitza. What's suffix gerushin? And here we have three cases of what's called a get that's posel midrabanan. And the Gemara is going to try to ask later on why didn't the Mishnah and Gerushin give the same kind of scenario where he threw a get with suffix karav lo, but anyway, here are the three cases of a get that's posel midrabanan. Number one, kasav b'ksav yada ve'ein alav eidim. There are no signatures on the get, but we clearly recognize the handwriting as that of the Baal. On a Doraisa level, Ksav Yada is considered like two Eidim. It's a foolproof shtar and it's a get kosher, but the Rabbanan pasaled it probably because it doesn't have a Zman in it. No. I mean to say it's as if it didn't have a Zman in it, because since there are no Eidim signed on it, we have to be afraid that maybe he wrote the wrong date on the shtar, on the get. Then we have a get sheyesh lav eidim v'ein bo zman. The Rabbanan made a takon of zman, and the get is possible without zman. And number three, we have a get sheyesh bo zman v'ein bo el echad. Now, what does that mean? Ein bo el echad. So that's the sugi gittin pei vav. According to Rav, we're talking about a case where, in addition to the signature of 1-8 on this get, the get was written b'ksav yada. And even though we've already mentioned that a ksav yad is posel b'Rabbanan, but the Tana wants to add that even if there's an aid that's signed on the shtar, it's still posel. And Shmuel over there in Gittin disagrees. He says we're talking about what's called ksav sofer b'yedech. In other words, we could recognize the writing of the scribe who wrote the get. And on a deraisa level, that's considered a get kosher because we can mitzaref the ksav sofer together with the 1-8 who signed on the get. The Chachamim pasaled this get. They were choshesh that maybe the sofer who wrote the get, he was just learning how to write a get. He didn't write it l'shma for this couple. Zeu suffix gerush. But again, Shimon gave Rivka, his wife, one of these three various kitten before he died. And in that case, Rivka has the status of a suffix megureshes, Hatzara, Choletzes v'lo misyabebes, because Rivka is one of the 15 arayos to Reuven. But they cannot be even because the Chachamim pasal this get lechatchila. The Gemara now analyzes. The Mishnah says, Ketzad Safek, Kiddushin, Safek Karvla, the Ilu Gerushin, Safek Karvla, Lo Kitani. Why didn't the Mishnah give that as an example and be consistent with the Reisha? My timer. Why did he change the whole song and dance here for a Safek Gerushin? My Rabbah, it would not make sense. The Mishnah could not have possibly formulated a Safek Gerushin in the case of Safek Karvla, to tell us that the Tzara needs Chalitza Misafek. Why? Because Isha Zu, this woman Sarah, who is the possible Tzoras Erva, is Bechesekas Hetel Shukomedes. Right before the get that was given to Rivka, Hatzara, which is Safek Gerushin, Sarah was Omedes Lios Muteris L'Shuk with the death of her husband Shimon. And the reason for that is because clearly at this moment, she is a Tzara to Rivka, who is an Erva vis-a-vis Ruvain the Yavam, and Umisafik, and now as a result of the creation of a suffix with Rivka with a Gerushin, Atabali Osra, you're coming to say that she cannot marry anyone, she needs Chalitza, because maybe the Gerushin of Rivka, the Erva, was a valid Gerushin, which means that Sarah is not a Tzara's Erva. So you're taking her, Sarah, out of the status of Cheskas Muteres L'Shuk. We should say Hamid Gavra B'Cheskas Heter. She was Muteres L'Shuk as a Tzoras Erva before the Safek Gerushin of Rivka. Al Tasrena L'Shuk Misafek. And therefore the Tana, who requires Chalitza, could not interpret it as Safek Gerushin in the case of Safek of Karav Lo, Safek Karav Lo. Because in such a scenario, in such a case, she would be Muteres L'Shuk even without Chalitza because of the Cheskes Heter. Amalei Abayi Hachi, if you're building your case on the Cheskes Heter, then what about a case where at the time of the latest Asafek, she was definitely Asura L'Shuk? But now she might become Muteres L'Shuk with the death of her husband. And in fact, she now is Muchzekes Beheter L'Shuk with the death of her husband. So now you have a Safek Gerushin of the Erva who is Muteres L'Shuk, is therefore besafek kedushin nami nema isha zu becheskes heter liyavam omedes. Sarah is the tzara of Rivka, who's the Erev on Ruvain, and as long as her husband Shimon is alive, she's becheskes heter liyavam omedes. Because before the Kedushin of Shimon to Rivka, the so-called the Safek Kedushin, she is Zekuka LeRuven. Meaning if Shimon dies, she falls for even to Reuven, and that's the end of the story. They'll be evil. Now, because of a Safek Kedushin between Shimon and Rivka, you're telling me that she loses her Cheskas Het Eliyama. When we suffer at the Bali Osra, you're coming to Asa the Yibum to Ruvain because of a possibility that maybe the Kedushin of Rivka, who's an Erva on Ruvain, was a valid Kedushin, and therefore you're going to pater up Sarah as the Tzara of an Erva. She's a Safek Tzaras Erva. Here also we should say Namid Gavra al Cheskasa, and we should remain and retain the Cheskas Sarah that she's Muteres Liyibum. Al Tasrena Misafek. So why aren't you being consistent? And the Gemara answers Hasam Lechumra in the case where Meikar Adin and Yechinami, you're correct because the Cheskes Hetel Yavam based on Chazaka, but the Rabbana Machmir, they're not going to rely on this Chazaka. They're going to say, no, we're not going to allow Yibum. We're going to require Chalitza. So the Gemara asks, "Hi, Chumra diasil de kulu." You want to be machmir in order to block yibum? That's going to be a chumra that brings to a kula. a takola. How so? Zimnin means it might happen, from time to time. The ozil hu mekadesh lo lachosa kiddushay vada. That the mekadesh who was mekadesh the erva in a suffix kiddushin, then he goes ahead and he marries her sister, and the status of that marriage is likewise a Kedushay suffix. Is Kedushay Vada. So the Azil who, the Makadesh who's Makadesh the Erev B'Sofik Kedushin, Makadesh L'Lachosa, he marries the sister of the Safek Kedushin, but Kedushay Vada. So again, Reuven and Shimon are brothers. Shimon marries Rachel, and then Shimon is Mekadesh Rachel, who's one of the Yud Tesvav Arais to Reuven, with Kedushay Safek. Now these two brothers, Reuven and Shimon, have a third brother on the mother's side, a maternal brother. We call him Levi. Rachel has a sister by the name of Leah. After Shimon was Mekadesh Rachel with Kedushay Safek, and Rachel again is one of the 15 Arayas to Reuven, then Halach v'Kiddush es Leah achosa b'Kedushay Vada. So Shimon was Mekadesh Rachel b'Kedushay Safek, and now he was Mekadesh her sister Leah. Now Levi, who's Shimon's brother on the maternal side, he also is Mekadesh Leah. Now, according to the strict letter of the law, the Kedushay Shimon of Levi are Kedushay Safek. And the reason for that is because the Kedushin of Shimon to Rachel from the beginning was a Safek Kedushin. And therefore, his Kedushin to Leah, who's the sister of Rachel, is also Kedushay Safek. And since she's a Safek Achos, right, because of the fact that she's Safek Achos Ishto Shel Shimon, and there's no Thesis Kedushin in Erva, in Chavi Krisis. And if that be the case, like a domino theory, the Kedushin that Levi was Mekadesh Leah is also a Safek. Because if there was Tfisas Kedushin of Shimon B'Leah, then she's Ashes Ach, and there's no Tfisas Kedushin in Ashes Ach. So regarding this case, the Gemara is saying that through a Chumrah, you're going to come to a Kula. You're being machmir to say that Rivka is considered the tzara of Rachel, and we're not going to allow Yibum. Well, guess what? There's going to be a takola that's going to come as a result of this Kula in the case of Kedushay Levi. Right? We'll see this as we go along. The Inami, and there's additional takola that is a repercussion of the Chumrah to say that the tzara of an erva shenis kadsha b'kedushay safek should not have yibum. Zimnin, another scenario that apparently is somewhat common. The asa acher, meaning someone from the shuk, mekadesh lo l'dida, he marries this very same woman who's a safek mekudeshes l'rishon, the kedushay vade bechai baila. For example, Reuven has a daughter named Rivka, and Reuven's brother Shimon marries Sarah. He also, Shimon is Mekadesh Rivka, the daughter of his brother Reuven. And that marriage was B'Kedushay Suffolk. Now someone comes to the shuk, we'll call him Avram, and he also is Mekadesh Rivka B'Kedushay Vada. Now Shimon dies without any children. According to the strict letter of the law, the Kedushin of Avram to Rivka are Kedushay Suffolk because she's already Suffolk B'Kudeshes to Shimon. But V'Kevan, since you're now being Machmir, the Asar Lamar Litzara Shal Erva Sheniskacha B'Kedushay Suffolk Liyabume. Now we could have a real takola, because people see that the tzara is not misyabemis. Amri, they'll draw the conclusion that Kedushay de Kama, the Kedushin of the Baal to his wife, are valid Kedushin, and therefore the tzara is not misyabemis, she's a tzaras erva, and therefore the subsequent Kedushin, the Basra, or in the first case, the Kedushin of Shimon, who's Mekadesh himself, Leah, the sister of Rachel, or in the second case, the Kedushin of Avram of Rivka, Lav Kedushin. So because you generated an Isa Yibum, people are going to say that the Kedushin were a valid Kedushin, therefore she's a Tzaras Erva. Well, look at the price you're going to pay. They're now going to say that the subsequent marriages are not Kedushin. So that's going to be a takola. So once again, we're left with the question, how do we justify this takana of a chumrah, which is asili day kul? This is where we're going to stop for today, and tomorrow, B'Shem, we'll pick up Daf Lamed Aleph.